Roughly $900 million in Russian strike capability went dark in 1 minute on the Dnipro River axis. A convoy built to deliver blackout attacks, missiles, launch support, reload assets, and the trucks that make the whole system breathe was reduced to burning frames and scattered crates in 60 seconds. That's not just vehicles destroyed. That's weeks of scheduled strikes canceled, aircraft sitting on the ramp with nothing coordinated to pair with, and a frontline command forced to rewrite the calendar under pressure. And sentence 4 is, the gut punch, one convoy loss can erase 45% of a sector's planned long-range tempo for the week. Not because Russia lacks missiles, but because it lacks the machine that moves them. This is the post-strike autopsy of the Russian blackout missile convoy / Kaliber logistics and launch vehicles in southern Ukraine, Kherson Oblasts. Stay with us, because the twist isn't spectacle. The twist is restraint. Ukraine didn't chase a target. It waited for the target to become a trap. Also, it wasn't chaos. It was calculation. They called it a routine move, a standard displacement, a logistics pulse, a convoy that could slide along the Kherson road grid, touch a river-adjacent staging site, and keep the blackout pressure alive. But the damage pattern says otherwise. The way it ended, fast, total, and timed, reads like a verdict. No improvisation, no lucky guess, no second chances. No improvisation, no lucky guess, no second chances. 8:52 p.m. The first condition forms. Compression. The convoy is no longer dispersed across multiple safe points. It's stacked into a single moving unit and a single destination logic. That change costs Russia options immediately. When assets cluster, survivability becomes conditional instead of assumed. That pause costs Russia at least one launch window. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what this convoy actually represents. Russia's long-range strike posture in the south isn't just a missile, it's a chain, storage to transport to fueling, and checks to launch support to comms coordination to battle damage assessment to reload. Break any link and you don't get fireworks, you get silence. And silence in this war is not peace, it's a missing function. Russia's blackout doctrine depends on simultaneity, not perfect simultaneity, enough overlap to overload, cruise missiles for infrastructure, ballistic threats to force air defenses to hold position, drones to eat attention. A convoy like this is the bloodstream that allows those layers to keep arriving on schedule. 9:31 p.m., a second condition locks in, dependency. The convoy is timed to align with a predictable handoff, night movement, reduced civilian traffic, and a narrow set of usable routes near the Dnipro River axis. That shift removes a full strike cycle from the week if it fails, because the schedule was written around it, and once a schedule depends on a single node, that node stops being logistics. It becomes a target. No detours, no redundancy, no invisibility. The Russian mindset here is familiar. Protect the missile. You protect the launcher, protect the expensive things. They prepare for the wrong layer. They expect Ukrainian attention to chase the launchers themselves. High value, high profile, and usually defended. They plan against the obvious threat, long-range precision, sabotage, perhaps a raid, but the real layer is always underneath. The fuel point, the reload cycle, the parked interval, the crew shift, the maintenance gap, the moment the convoy becomes a queue instead of a formation, that's where modern strike systems die. 10:14 p.m. the warning signal appears as an absence, no chatter spike, no frantic repositioning, no emergency dispersion. Ukraine doesn't react the way Russia expects. That calm is the tell. Throughput drops, not to zero, but low enough to matter, because the convoy keeps moving as if it's safe. If you knew your enemy's best shot was not shooting, where would you wait? And this is the part most people misunderstand. Waiting is not passive. Waiting is a discipline. Ukraine's patience on the Kherson axis is an operational choice. Observe, confirm, and only strike when the logistics math becomes irreversible. The river shapes everything here, routes funnel, bridges and crossings become pressure points. Russia can move, yes, but not freely, not without repeating patterns, no broadcasts, no noise, no early strike. 10:58 p.m., the convoy's movement tightens again, a minor friction event, traffic compression near a staging turnoff, an enforced spacing change, a brief halt to regroup, turns a moving unit into a stacked line. At that timestamp, Russia loses tempo. Readiness becomes conditional instead of assumed. This wasn't protection, it was rigidity. Russia often buys security with bureaucracy, convoy procedures, spacing rules, pre-planned stops, standardized route discipline. It looks professional, it photographs well, it makes commanders feel in control, but efficiency has a price. And in a drone-saturated war, efficiency becomes exposure because predictability is a censor's favorite meal. Ukraine's objective isn't to destroy a truck, it's to destroy the unit, the entire system. Not a piece that can be replaced in a day, but the set of capabilities that only exists when everything arrives together. No spacing, no separation, no escape lanes. 11:42 p.m. The trap condition completes. Fueling and checks begin at a point close enough to the river axis to matter and far enough from hardened cover to be lethal. And something else happens, an absence again. The area becomes too quiet, the kind of quiet that means crews believed they're outside the threat envelope. That silence costs Russia at least one launch window because once fueling starts, you don't sprint, you commit. What do you do when the only safe moment is the moment you can't move? Now comes the misreaction, the human part, the expensive mistake. Defenders don't fail because they are weak. They fail because they are busy tracking the wrong thing. Russia's layered defense around key strike assets is built to intercept what it can see early, high-flying surveillance, known corridors, predictable incoming profiles. But Ukraine's best pressure on this axis often comes from the cheap layer, a small drone, a loitering munition, a low-altitude strike queue, something that doesn't announce itself with radar signatures worth bragging about. Cheap versus expensive every time. A drone that costs tens of thousands, forcing a defense posture that costs millions per hour to maintain. Cheap versus expensive. Decoys that cost less than a car, pulling attention away from assets worth entire battalions of budget. To cheap versus expensive, a single precision strike package trading against a convoy whose function equals dozens of missiles. 12:26 a.m., Russia reacts to the wrong layer. Attention shifts to a false contact or a distant cue, something that demands eyes and bandwidth. At that timestamp, coverage thins where it matters most. That delay removes a full strike cycle from the weak, because the convoy's protection is now pointed the wrong direction. The system worked. That's why it failed. Here's the critical mechanic. Convoy defense isn't just weapons, it's attention allocation. If the defenders are looking up, they're not looking sideways. If they're chasing a decoy, they're not guarding the halt point. If they're cycling radars and comms, they're not noticing that the real warning signal is the lack of Ukrainian noise. No alarms. No flares, no panic yet. 1:03 a.m. The decisive alignment begins. The convoy is at peak vulnerability, vehicles close, crews dismounted, procedures underway, and the defensive posture mentally relaxed. At that timestamp, Russia loses initiative. It's no longer choosing the pace, it's hoping nothing happens before checks complete. That pause costs Russia at least one launch window. If you were Ukraine, would you strike the first truck or the middle? Because destroying the front is dramatic. Destroying the middle is fatal. A convoy is a spine. Break it at the center and everything behind it jams. Everything ahead of it is isolated, and the entire unit becomes a fire problem. 1:47 a.m., a thin, narrow gap opens, seconds where the defender's attention is split, communications are busy, and the convoy is still clustered. And at that timestamp, exposure is created, no redundancy, no dispersal, no margin, and then the 10-second window arrives. 2:11 a.m., the window is measured in heartbeats, a short interval where the convoy is committed to its position, defensive coverage is misaligned, and Ukraine's strike queue is already inside the decision loop. At that timestamp, Russia loses time, not metaphorically, operationally. That delay removes a full strike cycle from the week. Ukraine executes the decisive action with high-level precision, rapid strike effects concentrated on the convoy's functional nodes: fuel, reload, command vehicle, and the clustered transport frames that make movement possible. Not loud, not sprawling, precise enough that the convoy doesn't scatter. It stops existing as a unit. No convoy, no reload, no launch support. 2:12 a.m., the first secondary detonation confirms the kill chain is working. Fuel or munitions cook off, forcing immediate abandonment and making fire suppression impossible. At that timestamp, Russia loses readiness. Readiness becomes conditional instead of assumed. 2:13 a.m., the second strike effect lands into the now frozen line, vehicles unable to maneuver, crews disoriented, comms saturated. At that timestamp, Russia loses tempo again. Throughput drops, not to zero, but low enough to matter. 2:14 a.m., the unit is effectively erased. The surviving vehicles are either immobilized, burning, or cut off from safe exit routes. At that timestamp, Russia loses options. No alternate routes. No quick recovery. No rapid reconstitution. What followed wasn't a warning, it was a bill. And bills don't get negotiated at the front. They get paid in delays, canceled strikes, and commanders explaining why the schedule is now fiction. 2:53 a.m., the first downstream consequence hits. Emergency response and recovery attempts trigger their own vulnerabilities: movement, lights, radio traffic, and predictable routes to the site. At that timestamp, Russia loses confidence. No calm logistics, no routine operations, no invisible rear. Efficiency became exposure. Now zoom out. The blackout concept depends on rhythm. If the South can deliver synchronized pressure, Ukraine's grid and infrastructure stay under a constant shadow. But a rhythm is fragile. Miss one beat and the song changes. 5:41 a.m., the morning after. The absence becomes the warning signal. Planned launches do not occur. The sky is quiet in the way commanders dread. Quiet not because they chose restraint, but because the machine is missing parts. At that timestamp, Russia loses initiative. That pause costs Russia at least one launch window. No launch window, no coordinated pressure, no planned darkness. And this is where the real damage lives. The convoy wasn't only carrying missiles or support gear, it was carrying confidence, the belief that Russia could keep the South on a timetable. Now the timetable is compromised. 8:09 a.m., frontline units begin to feel the effect. Air defense and aviation coordination shifts because long-range strikes are not arriving as expected to shape Ukrainian movements. At that timestamp, Russia loses tempo and Ukraine gains breathing space to reposition. That delay removes a full strike cycle from the week. Cheap versus expensive again. A relatively low-cost strike package deleting the value of missiles that cost millions each, not by intercepting them, but by preventing them from being launched on schedule. Cheap versus expensive, the cost of replacing trucks and train crews versus the cost of losing strategic timing. Cheap versus expensive, a destroyed logistics unit versus the cascading expense of rerouting, security surges, and emergency dispersal. 11:27 a.m., the 24-hour scramble begins. Russia attempts to rebuild the chain, reroute supplies, pull vehicles from other sectors, increase escort, adjust launch planning. At that timestamp, Russia loses time, the one resource it can't manufacture. That pause costs Russia at least one launch window. No time, no rhythm, no certainty. And note the humiliation: the South doesn't pause because Ukraine won a firefight. It pauses because Russia's logistics are now afraid of their own patterns. 3:18 p.m., second-order effects appear: increased convoy escorts, longer dwell times, more checks, more spacing. At that timestamp, Russia loses throughput. Throughput drops, not to zero, but low enough to matter. This wasn't protection. It was rigidity. Because every added layer of control adds predictability. And predictability is what Ukraine was waiting for. 7:02 p.m. So, what moment? Russia can still strike. It can still fire missiles. The point is that it can't do it when it wants, at the scale it planned, on the rhythm it needs. At that timestamp, Russia loses choice. That delay removes a full strike cycle from the week. No choice. No tempo. No dominance. Now we enter the 72-hour window where the damage becomes structural. A destroyed convoy is not just equipment loss. It is training loss, crew loss, procedures rewritten, new routes tested, new deception plans required. And all of it happens while Ukraine keeps fighting, while artillery keeps speaking, while drones keep watching, while the river axis keeps punishing movement. Day 2, 6:33 a.m. The silence returns as warning. Reduced movement near key staging points, fewer routine resupply patterns, less visible confidence. At that timestamp, Russia loses initiative again. Readiness becomes conditional instead of assumed. If the rear is afraid, what happens to the front? No steady supply, no predictable support, no calm commanders. Day 2, 10:46 a.m., Russia begins reallocating security assets, more air defense coverage for logistics, more escort for convoys, more surveillance over roads that used to be safe enough. At that timestamp, Russia loses resources elsewhere. That pause costs Russia at least one launch window, because protection now competes with execution. The system worked. That's why it failed. Because a system that requires constant protection is a system that can be economically bled. Ukraine doesn't have to destroy everything. It only has to force Russia to spend time and assets protecting everything. Day 2, 4:12 p.m. Command behavior shifts. Risk tolerance collapses. Movements become delayed until perfect conditions appear. Conditions that rarely appear in a surveilled battle space. At that timestamp, Russia loses tempo, and tempo is the weapon behind the weapon. That delay removes a full strike cycle from the week. No tempo, no surprise, no sustained pressure. Day 3, 7:55 a.m., the replacement attempt happens, substitute vehicles, alternate staging, different timing. But substitutes introduce friction, mismatched crews, unfamiliar routes, and slower checks. At that timestamp, Russia loses efficiency. Throughput drops, not to zero, but low enough to matter. Prestige created predictability. Because those strike systems are prestigious, they are showcased, they are doctrinally central. And doctrinally central systems produce doctrinally predictable movements. Which means Ukraine doesn't need perfect intelligence. It needs pattern recognition. No mystery, no magic, no mercy. Day 3, 1:29 p.m., a hard reality lands. The South can no longer assume its blackout package will arrive on schedule. Launch planning becomes, if possible, not as ordered. At that timestamp, Russia loses readiness. Readiness becomes conditional instead of assumed. From that point forward, Russia wasn't choosing when to strike. It was waiting to be ready again. That is the humiliation, not the fireball, not the video. the forced waiting. Now step back and read the structure. Confidence, dependency, collapse. Russia's confidence was procedural, convoys, schedules, doctrine. That confidence created dependency, clustered movement, predictable staging, narrow routes near the Dnipro axis. And that dependency created collapse. 1 minute of precision deleting a week of rhythm. No rhythm, no blackout, no leverage. This is the modern lesson. Raw strength is not the deciding factor when systems are interlocked. Timing is. Dependency is. Pressure points are. A convoy is not support. It is the condition that allows power to exist at distance. And in Kherson Oblast, the river makes dependency unavoidable. Every crossing, every road, every staging point becomes a place where time can be stolen. 5:08 p.m. Final consequence. The strike changes behavior. Russia's next convoys will move slower, with heavier escorts, at less efficient times, and with longer pauses. At that timestamp, Russia loses initiative in the strategic sense, because initiative isn't moving first, it's moving freely. That pause costs Russia at least one launch window. No freedom. No tempo. No dominance. So here's the question that matters, and it's not comfortable. If Ukraine can delete a blackout convoy on the Dnipro axis in 60 seconds, what other safe routines are still being treated as untouchable? If you were Russia, which dependency would you hide first? If you were Ukraine, which dependency would you hunt next? And if the real warning signal is silence, what silence should both sides fear tomorrow? Comment your take, like, subscribe, and follow for more clear breakdowns.